Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Curt Langlotz, Director of the Amy Center, and I'm here pleased to be a part of session 4, What's Next? We've had a great day, many thought-provoking presentations. And so what we are doing in this session is bringing together some luminaries to hear their insights on the various topics that have been raised today. The structure of our session is I'd like to introduce our panelists briefly and have them make a few comments and reactions to the topics of today. And then we'll open it up to your questions. Please feel free to enter your questions on Slido. We're monitoring that and we'll be happy to pose those to the panelists. And we look forward to a really great and stimulating discussion. So let's get started. Our first panelist is Eric Topol. He is founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute. He's a professor of molecular medicine and executive vice president of Scripps Research. He has been elected to the National Academy of Medicine and is one of the top 10 most cited researchers in medicine. He's edited several textbooks and published 3 bestseller books, including Deep Medicine, How AI Can Make Healthcare Human Again. He's a great friend of Stanford and co-edits the Dr. Penguin site that tracks the latest in AI and healthcare research. Dr. Topol, we're delighted to have you here today and welcome your comments.
Thanks, Curt. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the session. I mean, it's still early in the AI and medicine era, both for clinicians and for patients, but I don't think the patients get enough regard for where it can take them. And I'm looking forward to this discussion to kind of look at that perspective, which hasn't been emphasized enough. And so I'm pleased to be joined with such great panelists and you to discuss these points.
Great. Thank you. Our next panelist is Nina Kottler, who is a practicing radiologist with a degree in applied mathematics and optimization theory. She was the first radiologist to join Radiology Partners, which is the largest radiology practice in the United States. She has multiple leadership positions there. She's currently a vice president of clinical operations and associate chief medical officer for clinical AI, serving on their innovation steering committee. She volunteers on many groups for the American College of Radiology, Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine, and the Radiological Society of North America. And in 2018 received the Rad Equals Trailblazer Award, which recognizes a pioneering female leader in imaging informatics. So Dr. Kottler, we're happy to have you here.
Thanks, Curt. I'm very happy to be here. And it is a really wonderful panel, a great topic. And I hope, I mean, I'm not an ethics expert, but I hope in including people like myself, it's really sort of showing that we're all here to learn. And so that's a lot about what this panel is about. I've done a lot of my own education about ethics and what's the right thing to do. And I think we all need to be coming together to figure that out because no one person has all the answers.
Great. Terrific thoughts. Our next panelist is Andrea Borondy. She is a retired aerospace engineering executive with advanced degrees in management from MIT and a master's in public health from the University of Connecticut. She lost her husband to lung cancer in 2013 and is now a lung cancer and patient advocate and consultant. She's a board member for the Rescue Lung Society, associate editor for the Journal of the American College of Radiology, a member of the National Lung Cancer Roundtable, and volunteers for the American Lung Association. She's also COO of Prosumer Health, the startup company developing a smartphone accessible AI-driven health maintenance and improvement platform. We're delighted to have her here. She tweets as @FindLungCancer and can be is a strong patient advocate. So Andrea, we're happy to have you.
Thank you, Curt, very much. I really appreciate being here. I'm thrilled, and I've already been labeled a troublemaker, so I will try to continue to do that throughout. And I really want to bring the patient perspective. And I totally agree with Eric Topol that there hasn't been enough of that during the day. My favorite experience was when I was working at Leahy Hospital Medical Center. They had a patient experience committee, but I wasn't allowed to be on it because I was a patient. So hopefully I'm glad that that's not the case here.
Great. Well, we're delighted to have your perspective this afternoon. And then our last panelist is Tim O'Brien. Tim has over 30 years of experience as an engineer, marketer, and consultant in the tech industry, both at startups and Fortune 500 companies. He is trained as an engineer and has an MBA and a Master's of Law. He leads ethical AI advocacy at Microsoft and is responsible for programs to drive and promote responsible development and use of technology, including public policy and ethics of AI. Tim conducts focused research on technology policy and the ethical use of AI and is a frequent speaker on ethics and responsible use of technology. And he's been featured frequently in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, MIT Sloan Management Review, and NPR. Tim, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here, Curt. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I think of all the vertical industries that are grappling with a lot of these ethical issues relating to AI. The healthcare space is very much at the leading edge of some of these issues. So very much looking forward to it today.
Great. Well, so I think we've already touched on this even a little bit in the introductions, but let's start by focusing on the patient concerns. So what do we see as some of the key patient concerns in the use of AI in healthcare or the use of their data in training AI models? What do patients really want from developers of algorithms and users of algorithms?
Well,
Andrea, I'll start with you.
Well, some of the things, if you take a look at a lot of the recent surveys that have been done, patients really want to keep the physician in charge. They don't want to have unsupervised AI. They want to get the results from the physician. They trust their physician. They want to keep the physician, that relationship going. They're concerned that physician skills may actually atrophy because of reliance on AI. So that whole decision support that we talked about earlier, about how decision support, people don't even know that it's being used. Well, they're concerned about that the skills would atrophy. They're concerned that AI may be hacked, that they might get the wrong decision. How do they know that that there hasn't been someone who's gone in there and hacked and used their data or provided the wrong answer for them or hacked their wearable device, their pacemaker? They're concerned about privacy breaches. They want regulation of AI. And it's interesting, earlier today, someone said, well, patients have a responsibility to provide their data for research and for the public good. And I think most patients would agree with that they want to provide their data for research in the public good, but they're worried about the commercial use of their data and the sale of their data. If we're not ethical about it and really do share, sell data, we might end up like the sperm banks, where the donors they go directly to the donors to get the sperm instead of, going through other means. Are big companies going to go directly to patients to buy their data if the other institutions are selling it? So just a few of my thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think those are valid concerns and something that we've heard as well. And even though decision support, other forms of decision support, non-AI, have been used for some time, these kinds of really powerful tools have, I think, caused some additional concern or really highlighted maybe concerns that patients have always had but haven't really thought carefully about until recently. And so I think it's great that you're bringing those up. Do any others have comments on this question? Nina?
I can.
Or Tim? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nina, if you.
No, feel free, Tim, go ahead.
I think, I agree with everything that Andrea said. I think I tend to look at this through the lens of vulnerable communities and the distrust that they have in healthcare historically, independent of AI and algorithms and anything that we're talking about now. And we've seen a lot of instances of societal bias, unfairness, racial inequality effectively being ingested into these systems in the form of data sets used to train models and then replicated at best or compounded at worst. And so there's a lot of data about this, a lot of research about it. There's one case in particular, it was widely publicized in medical circles about 2 years ago involving a tool developed by Optum that's used on some 200 million patients in the United States. It was assigning risk scores, health risk scores to patients based on the how much money they spent on healthcare in the course of a year. And within the data set used to train that model, Black patients and white patients had both spent equal amounts. So this was effectively race neutral from the standpoint of how much spending was going on. But within the subset of the data set that looked at Black patients, they were sicker, higher instances of anemia, high blood pressure, diabetes. So they were rated as lower risk than white patients with similar chronic conditions. And so you can start to see, the inequality in terms of access to healthcare, that's just well documented, been going on for a very, very long time, large body of research there, was effectively incorporated into this model without any malicious intent, but rather just an over-reliance on data combined with some very bad assumptions about people who spend a lot of money on healthcare must be very sick, and people who don't spend much money on healthcare must not need much healthcare. In fact, the opposite is true when you look at socioeconomic factors and who's sicker in this country versus who's healthier. So I do think that there's an increasing suspicion within vulnerable communities about the degree to which the healthcare community is relying on data from people in society to automate and support a lot of these decisions made in clinical environments about who gets what healthcare.
Yeah, and the other thing we heard today was that a regulatory approval process really doesn't consider those disparities either. So that if you have a particular claim that it's going to work in a broad group that could be heterogeneous, some under some vulnerable communities, some not vulnerable, as long as the algorithm meets that claim, the FDA is likely to approve it.
Yeah,
and we also heard about the consent process, that if we have a consent process that's kind of an opt-in, let's only use the data of people who say, yes, I consent to have my data used. That also is likely to, the people who are vulnerable or underprivileged are less likely to consent to that. So there's some kind of inherent difficulties in correcting that problem.
Yep.
Nina, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
Well, I want to echo what Tim said. I mean, he's talking about bias in data. The algorithms that we use are trained based on the data that they have been interpreting and learning how to use. And bias on its own, I mean, it's just a threat to equity and equality, because there's often either an arbitrary, just because we're not looking at it, or even worse, so a programmatic departure from equal treatment, because there's unequal distribution of people getting access to resources and including their data in our sample. And like you said, Curt, the FDA has some regulations about it, but they're not ensuring that these algorithms are going to work fairly for all people. So it is something that we have to consider. And for patients, especially, as a clinician, we have a relationship with our patients. I mean, I'm a radiologist, but I feel like the patients I treat, even if I'm not talking to them, that's my responsibility. And it's part of my moral code to make sure I'm doing the best thing for them. And there's a lot about AI that's difficult to understand. I mean, frankly, a lot of physicians don't even understand some of the components. So it's really essential that we do a lot to educate the public about how these algorithms work, how they're being used. And I agree with Andrea that we should have a physician that is overseeing them, because they're also not perfect.
Tim, were you going to make a comment?
Well, I was thinking about something that Nina said about educating the public about how these work. I mean, as most of us know, artificial intelligence has been around, at least in theory, since Alan Turing wrote the first paper in 1950. So it's been around forever, but it's only become commercially viable in the last decade because of the arrival of deep learning in 2012. And deep learning, for all of its accuracy and all that it's done to advance the practice of machine learning, it's not known for intelligibility and transparency. So I wholeheartedly agree with Nina. Educating people about what these machines do and why they're making the decisions that they make is incredibly important, but it's becoming technically more and more impossible given the sophistication of some of these deep learning models. So we can talk more about that later. I just was top of mind based on Nina's comment.
Yeah, I think that just really emphasizes the fact that it has to be physician supervised, and that it has to be the physician-patient relationship or the clinician-patient relationship that really decides on what's going on. I think it's important for patients to know that AI is being used in their care, but for the clinician to say, yes, I'm being informed by AI, but I'm going to make the decision with you based on your individual characteristics, and we'll go forward from there. Because I don't think anyone, to your point, Tim, I don't think anyone can understand, especially the AI that's, black box and, not transparent at all. But we have to be transparent about the use of AI, how we're using it, and the fact that we're supervising the AI.
I think it's also important when you talk about education, it's education of the patients so that they understand when we're not using a certain tool and what that means to them. But we're going to have to educate our physicians very differently to properly consume this information. There's too much data out there for the way that we educate our own physicians now, right? There, when I was a resident, it was all about how much could you remember and just kind of throw out. But now we really need to, instead of trying to remember volumes of data, we should be teaching people about how to apply that data into knowledge and then how to translate that into something that both clinicians and patients can understand.
And to vet the data to make sure it's appropriate for that, vet the information, make sure it's appropriate for that use case, because there's a lot of AI out there, but not everything is appropriate for each use case. So that's the education you need, is how do you pick the appropriate use case?
I'm just going to differentiate as far as use cases, so I think the omission so far has been that there are select ways that patients can use AI for, whether it's to make the initial diagnosis of a heart arrhythmia through their smartwatch, or a urinary tract infection through an AI kit that they can pick up at a pharmacy in many parts of the world already, or a skin lesion, or ear infection of their children. These are doctorless approaches initially for screening, and then a clinician would be contacted as to potential follow-up. That's very different than the bigger picture, which is this integration of a person's, all of their inputs, electronic health records, and, from various providers folded into all the other layers of their data. So I think, this doctorless side, where it's democratized, which has its issues, of course, versus the one I think that's being discussed right now, which is a much more general, more challenging path, it should be noted.
That's a great point. And I just want to mention that Lee just made the same point on Slido, saying, what about these issues that are where we're helping patients and that the clinicians aren't necessarily involved. So I wanted to move to a slightly different topic, also that arose out of the meeting today, and that has to do with the health data as a public good. So we heard that data may not be the new oil, but it's maybe the new water, that it's something that everyone should be entitled to, and that we shouldn't have a lot of profit happening off of just the delivery of water to communities. On the other hand, we hear that there are companies out there, or even healthcare organizations, who are thinking of or proposing selling patient data. So I wanted to get your reactions to that, maybe starting with Nina, since you're at run a healthcare organization. I'll say on behalf of Stanford, we don't sell our patient data. Do you sell your patient data? And what are your thoughts on this question?
It's a great question. We do not sell our patient data. I really like how David Larson talks about it, in that, we're ethically obligated to make data useful. And once it has been used for the primary purpose, then the secondary purpose should be for the common or the better good of all patients. And so that data itself should not be owned by anyone, but it should be used responsibly by everyone in order to improve patient care. Now, I do think, however, that you could add value to data, right? Data itself all of our data is unstructured. It's images, it's reports. And if you extract structure and knowledge from that, like you do labels, or you extract information out of the radiology report to get a better understanding of what was being discussed, and you use that takes time and effort. And a lot of our vendors in AI are doing this. And I do think that is okay to then sell the model that comes from it, but not to benefit from the data on its own. It's rather to benefit from the knowledge that they put in and gleaned from that data.
Other thoughts on that question?
I was just going to say that this is actually the thing that gets me all riled up, which is
Good.
that you can't get all their data still today. That is, they are getting a fraction at best through portals, but they can't get their scans to share with other physicians. Still around 10% are replicated because of this issue. And, you know, each person should have their data. It's their data, not the health system or the clinician first. And we still don't give that. We don't give people that right. And it should be a civil right, just like many others. So those inputs are essential for the algorithms that are yet to be developed in the years ahead. That can be rich if each person had all their inputs. We know models exist, such as in Estonia and other places that provide for that, but we're not doing that. That's a different matter than the selling of data, which is egregious, particularly if it can be re-identified. But we can't even get the data. Now, not everybody realizes this, of course, but for those who want to be active in the future, this is going to become increasingly important. And we're dealing with incomplete inputs, which is going to compromise algorithms going forward.
Yeah, and I just like to add there, I totally agree with Eric Topol on this. I mean, I think patients should own their data, whether, you know, whatever you talk about data ownership. I know David Larson says nobody owns it, but patients should have access and should be the ones providing access to their data. I would say, I would posit that if patients had access and had all their data, it would be a more complete data set, and patients would be willing to share it for public and for public good and for research. And so we'd actually have a richer data set. We'd be able to get it easier. We'd have better patient care and better population health.
Yeah, so you're saying that if patients, the more control that patients have over their own data, the more likely they are to be willing to share it, perhaps.
Well, not only that, but the more likely they will be to have a complete data set. If the patients owned all their data and they had it all together, they'd have all their longitudinal data, all their history, all the socioeconomic factors, everything in one big data set. It's not just your clinical data. It's also, were you abused as a child? You know, all of those things factor into your overall health and population health. So if a patient had all of that in one place and was the person who actually provided access to the data, then I actually think you would have more accessible data, more likely to share, and a more complete data set with better outcomes and better information and better models.
Yeah, it's frustrating that more progress has not been made in that regard. I know that Don Rucker, when he was head of the Office of the National Coordinator, tried to put in place, I think did put in place some mechanisms, APIs for the propeller heads around here, that would allow us to pull our data from various sources. Do we think that in 5 or 10 years that we're just all going to have our full electronic records on our phones and we'll be able to click a button and say, I want this data to go to this provider or that provider? And isn't that something that we can accomplish?
It's certainly something we should strive toward, right? I mean, it is their humanity that we're looking at. And you can't take humanity out of medicine. It's a natural component. That's not something that should be sold or shared, except for the patient. Now, I think there is a little bit of a distinction, and I'm curious, like how it work out. In Europe, right? The European Union, the patient owns the data. In America or North America, America and Canada, I think the patient has access to the data. Unless you're in New Hampshire, maybe they don't own it. And I'm curious which is going to end up providing more availability of data. I strongly believe that patients should have access to their data and rights to do what they want. It's theirs, right? It's their humanity. But I also believe what David says about everyone should have access to this data to improve the overall good of the population. And what if there were a population that just said, I'm not going to share my data for the good of everyone else? Then how can we improve science for that group?
I think Nina touches on something which are fundamental differences between the United States and the EU. And how to think about this. Most Americans think the P in GDPR stands for privacy. It does not. stands for protection. And privacy says, I'm not going to tell you anything about myself. Protection says, I'm happy to tell you things about myself, but you have certain responsibilities to be a good steward of that, which is the way the Europeans think about it. And, the absence of a federal data privacy law broadly, just outside of the healthcare vertical, I think the absence of that is one of the issues that we're kind of dealing with here. I think it was fairly progressive for its time, but we just don't have a national federal piece of privacy legislation akin to GDPR in Europe. And I think that would be incredibly helpful to getting where I think we aspirationally want to go in terms of putting patients in control of everything about them.
Yeah, I mean, right now the digital footprint is such a threat to everybody because it's pretty much unregulated in the United States. It's not the data that's controlled by HIPAA. It's your grocery store card. It's your Google searches. It's all of that data agglomerated together that's going to be the biggest threat. So how do you regulate the full digital footprint?
Nina said the magic word, which is humanity. I'm not a fan of oil and water analogies because I think it just kind of dehumanizes what's actually going on here, which this is people we're talking about. And the buying and selling and trafficking of data in industries far outside of healthcare, digital advertising, et cetera. It's just kind of gotten out of control. And Andrea, you said something earlier about, are people building these models using a data set to train them that was actually intended for that purpose? The answer is probably in most cases, no, because I and many others from industry have been saying for a long, long time, the biggest cost associated with AI is data prep. Getting the data, normalizing the data, scrubbing it, getting noise out of it, labeling it in the case of supervised learning, it's expensive. And boy, wouldn't it be easy just to go to an open source repository, grab some data set that was put together for something completely unrelated and use that to try to train the model. And then, we have problems. So it's longer discussion, but things are pretty out of hand with the way that data is trafficked, certainly within the US.
Yeah, and great points. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, just, we recently at Scripps health system went through a month of the data being hijacked, ransomware, and talk about how a whole health system is shut down because people don't have their data. And we're not set up for this. And obviously we're seeing a lot more of these. And so that personal experience as a physician where patients can't even get to their portal, no less have their data separate from the health system. This really emphasized how serious the matter is.
Yeah. And the point made earlier that I think for most people, their credit card history probably has a lot more things they want to keep private than their medical record. Maybe not for everyone, but so those are major issues. There is a question from Slido for Eric. You've been a leader in the All of Us research program, and so Tim wanted to know what do you think that program, the influence that program will have on the representation of underrepresented populations and the downstream effects for fairness in AI?
Well, the good thing about the All of Us is it has near 400,000 people that are enrolled, and more than half of them are underrepresented minorities. So it's already the largest cohort that's been assembled as far as underrepresented minorities. It's planned to have 1 million. It may even wind up being multiple million if we ever really get digital about it. But it's going to make some important contributions. Unfortunately, it takes time because it's getting genomic data, sensor data, longitudinal, and making this all available to the biomedical community for research. So it's incubating, but it's moving well. And one thing of all the things to be proud of is that it's really done a great job on underrepresented minorities.
Mm-hmm. And then another good question from Tim, which relates to our discussion. If I go to the patient records department and ask for my records, I can get it on paper. Is the problem that we don't have more convenient systems for transferring data, or is it a technical or a policy problem? I'm happy to make a little comment about that. I mean, I think
from Tim or for Tim?
That is from Tim, and for Tim too, if you wish. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a combination of both. I think particularly in the imaging world, we have not had the technical means. We're building up to them. So there was a period a while ago where we had CDs, they didn't work well. They had viewers that were embedded on the CD, they didn't launch. It was just very difficult to get the data transferred in that way. We still have DVDs. That's still a way that we frequently transfer data. But there now are there are companies out there that provide internet-based exchange, and a lot of it relates now to making sure that the patient, where the place where the images are coming from, they get filed in the correct patient jacket, and all of those logistical concerns, which are also very important. And then the fact that the vendors in this space don't always talk to each other. And all of those problems are, I think, on the road to being solved, not nearly as fast as we would like, but we're getting to the point where we could have a national, internet-based image exchange network where any patient could get their images from anywhere else. But that's still a few years away. I think we're a little bit further ahead when it comes to other forms of data, but we're not there yet. Does anyone else have comments about where we are with respect to data exchange? Yes, Andrea.
Yeah, I mean, from a legislation standpoint, the ONC Cures Act basically makes it, available. Patients have the right to get any of their data free of charge, which is huge because I remember having to pay to get the records for my late husband. So that's a big deal. And now we're working through the logistics of how do we get that data. I moved about 2 years ago. And I actually had a lot of imaging done at this one imaging center. I actually got a stack of DVDs with all of my imaging data on it. Thank God I got that because it was helpful when I got to my new location. But we need to get to a point where it can all be accessed and stored in one location. As a patient, I want to get all that data. Right now I can't tell you how many portals I have. They're all on my phone. I can get on there. Every single place I have to go, I have to enter a different portal, do a different test, do a different check-in. That's not going to work. We need to consolidate all this to make it easier so that everybody has everything in one place.
And this is one area for sure that, Andrea, what you mentioned, that if the patient had access to their data, it would probably be easier for us to give these bigger data sets because the large groups integrating the healthcare enterprise groups that have been trying to do this, it's just taking a very long time.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that would help, but really hasn't been able to be accomplished here in the US at least, is a national identifier. That would make it somewhat easier to make these kinds of exchanges if we knew, this is the same patient across systems. We're getting there. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about the consent process. So we've had a number of discussions about the consent process today. The process is, so I know at Stanford, for example, we have a notice of privacy practices. It informs patients that their data may be used for research, subject to IRB and all of those kinds of things. But it's unclear that patients really fully understand that. And today, the consent process is perhaps someone who is getting a colonoscopy. They've been on NPO since midnight, and they're coming in the morning, and there's a whole bunch of papers that are set in front of them and to sign them. And if they have questions about something there, the person who's across the desk from them isn't someone who is really equipped to be able to answer those questions. So making changes in that process is fraught with difficulty, and yet you really want to find a way where we can educate patients and get more informed providers as well about all these issues. So comments, thoughts? Andrea, you had your hand up.
Just a very quick story. I've had 3 rounds of major hip surgery. After my second round, I was in ICU for 24 hours in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. They brought me a consent form. They wanted to transfuse and give me 2 units of blood. Now, I was, of course, going to say yes, but I read the consent form, and on there in the adverse side effects, they had, rarely, hardly ever, they didn't have the actual percentages. So I asked for the actual percentages. The poor nurse on duty, I still felt sorry for him. He tried to scramble to find it. Finally, I consented, but that's the kind of thing where, you have to be careful because not every patient is the same. So you can't have just one consent process because for most people that might have been fine. they would have signed it, no issues. It's not so much about the consent, but it's making sure that you're transparent and that the patient understands what they're consenting to. So I think it's really on the side of the clinician to say, this is what you're consenting to. I was a member of an IRB for several years, and went through lots and lots of consent forms. And once again, the clear thing there is the patient needs to understand what they're consenting to. And so the same form may not be valid for every single patient.
Well, right, and you're a sophisticated patient, and I can just imagine someone else in the ICU who's maybe not as capable, maybe they're sedated, who knows? Are we really doing a full service to the consent process in that situation, right?
But then the other side I would say is, I knew what I was doing, and I was going to eventually consent because I knew I needed the blood because I couldn't control my blood pressure. But you can't make it to the point where here's the patient that doesn't, and they say, no, and they're hesitant about healthcare. So what is the fine line there between, too much consent and, hey, this is a best practice, we have to do this now. Mm-hmm. So that's hard to do. And from the standpoint of data sharing for AI, I would say, Curt, that what you have from the standpoint of saying your data may be used for research, and I would add another line in there, and will not be sold for commercial purposes. I would add that line in there. I think that's fine for de-identified data. But if you're going to use identified data, I think that's where you need a more formalized consent process.
I really love that distinction, because it is a difference between what are the things that are actual best practices and we should be recommending, whether it's for ethical reasons or medical reasons, and what are the things that need consent? Because when you think about population health and big data, all of these things need the ability to scale. And if you can't scale them, you're not going to be able to implement them appropriately. So for AI algorithms, you need the data from, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of patients. There's no way you could talk to every single one of them, explain all of the components. So it's a really fine line to walk. I don't know the answers. I'm loving to hear what Andrea says, but I think that these are difficulties that we're going to have to struggle with.
The context in which these are used is problematic. I mean, the real world situation that Andrea described sounds a lot like what in contract law is described as an adhesion contract, which is basically a contract that can't be negotiated. So for example, an example of an adhesion contract is when you pull into a parking garage and you pull the ticket out and the crossing guard arm goes up and you turn it over and it's got all the terms and conditions. You can't throw your car into reverse and start yelling at the parking attendant and say, I want to negotiate this. Or if a pipe bursts in the winter and your living room is filling with water and the plumber shows up and said, sign this thing so I can start work, you're just not in a position. And so these consent forms that we're asked to sign under duress in the midst of potentially a medical emergency tend to have that kind of feel to it. So it goes beyond just the language and the terms and conditions that's in the contract, but the way in which they're used and whether or not the people who are handing us these forms and the clipboard and the pen are actually empowered to answer these questions or make edits in the margin and initial.
And as we talk about this, we should make the distinction between two different issues. So one is how we consent or inform patients about the use of their data, and the other is the consent for aspects of care or the use of AI or some other novel technology in their care. Those are two different issues. And I think, let me ask the panel, the sentiment from the experts we've heard from in the meeting so far was that with respect to data use, this notion of information, informing the patients that their data may be used in that way, as long as it's de-identified and used in aggregate, that is an acceptable mode of operation. Would everyone agree with that premise? I see nodding heads. Okay.
As long as it's not sold, as long as it's not sold. Even if it's sold in aggregate, if you sell 1 million scans in aggregate and get $10 for each scan, I don't think that's ethical.
Right. Well, and then the other question comes in, the data, so there's selling and not selling, and then there's commercial use and non-commercial use, right? So Stanford doesn't sell its data, but we make data sets available, or could make data sets available. We do make them available on the AMI website for non-commercial use. But on the other hand, perhaps it would be acceptable for us to say, you know, commercial use is okay because that commercial entity is adding value to those data. So that those are two separate questions as well, are they not? So we have, I think we have complete agreement about the issue of selling data, but then there's the issue of commercial use, right? So wouldn't the world be a better place if everyone, commercial and non-commercial, could go to wherever, the AMI website or somewhere else, and find data sets and use those to develop useful technology?
As long as it was useful commercial use. I mean, you know, how do you know that the data is not going to be used if it's totally open for commercial use, not going to be used for nefarious purposes? Yeah. So you got to make sure that it's used for the common good. And how do you regulate that? How do you monitor that? How do you make sure that that's what's happening?
Great. That is a perfect segue to our next topic, which is this notion that's come up a couple of times about ethics review boards. So David Magnus, for example, presented the Stanford approach at the Human-Centered AI Institute, one of the co-sponsors of this meeting, that the grants that are submitted for internal funding at Stanford undergo an ethical review by an ethical panel, and that's very different than an IRB. The IRB is designed to make sure that patients are protected. The ERB is designed to make sure that society is protected from dual use technologies and other issues like that. Do we think that that approach is an effective one? There were concerns about that this could become too bureaucratic, that it just becomes like a compliance process, and that really it should be about changing the culture of the organization. And maybe we should think more about that rather than putting in, you know, these ethical review boards. So what do we think about ethical review boards?
I think they're good if they're empowered. I completely agree that compliance as the one and only thing that you do is necessary but not sufficient. The thing you want to get to is a mindset change in which societal implications are considered at the formative stage of an idea rather than taking on the kind of technical debt that we've seen for decades now, where you implement something that you know to be flawed in anticipation of getting some near-term benefit, and you'll just kind of fix it later. In a clinical setting where you have life and death implications, obviously that sort of thing isn't as frequent as it is in commercial scenarios. It says, hey, here's this app that's full of bugs on your TV. But nonetheless, changing the way organizations think about design, development, deployment, monitoring, and usage at the formative stage of an idea is something that ethics review boards that are made up of interdisciplinary people can really be helpful for if they're empowered and have access to the senior leaders who are ultimately going to make the decision. But the implementing culture change in parallel is incredibly important. Otherwise, it just gets reduced to a compliance, right? You know, oh, here come the ethics people again to talk to my department. Right. You know, this is just going to waste half my day, and that's the risk that you run into. You want to create a situation where you have demand for those people to come talk to you because you'll learn something. The product you ship will be better. The outcomes will be better.
And you have to take a look at it at systems level. We know that systems are complex and there's unintended consequences. So you have to do sort of like a failure cause and effects diagram. What are the possible things that could go wrong, and really try and protect from them? If the ethics board could do it that way, really help find out what are some of the unintended things that can go wrong so that you design for them up front, or have off ramps so you can get off, that would be a helpful use for the ethics.
Part of why we need ethics review boards are because we have a common language, I suppose, but we don't have a common moral framework for which we're applying to artificial intelligence. It's all too new. And there's tons of articles out there, different agencies that have different morals and values that they're applying to ethics, but they're applying to AI, ethics applied to AI, but they're applying it in different ways, and they may mean different things. And if you think like there's only going to be certain groups that are able to actually have an ethical review board, is the small private practice going to be able to have that? And there is ethics in not just the production of AI, but also the distribution and usage of AI. So I think we need something that is done more globally to make sure that the small groups and the groups that can't manage that have some framework to go by. I love talking about it as a part of your culture. We live in a culture in my practice that is value-based. And that means that we don't have to think about every single decision because it's based on our internal values. And if you make those decisions as value-based for your ethics of AI, then you don't need to have the group that comes in to oversee it. It's just a part of who you are.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
Unintended consequences are sometimes hard to forecast. And COVID was and continues to be an interesting test case because it's novel for obvious reasons, but it was a public health emergency of the highest order, which led to a lot of rushed AI into the breach, motivated in large part by a lot of tech solutionism sort of attitudes that there's no problem technology can't fix, not even this one, and a lot of very flawed, poorly performing, harmful technology showed up in clinical settings without a lot of transparency into how it was working. And there was a pretty big study published in the British Medical Journal recently describing how researchers looked at something like 230 different algorithms that were used to try to detect and help with COVID cases, and none of them were fit for clinical use. There's one model that used a data set that contained chest scans of children who didn't have COVID to help the model learn, here's what COVID versus non-COVID looks like. And the model learned what children versus non-children look like, which is just clinically useless.
Yeah.
There was another one that had a mix of scans involving patients who were scanned while they were standing up versus those who were lying down. Because if you're seriously ill, you're probably more likely to be lying down. It used your position while you got scanned as a predictor of your COVID risk.
Mm-hmm.
Again, useless.
Yeah.
The weirdest one involved text fonts on the scans themselves. Some hospitals have Times New Roman, others have Arial. And so if the AI got a scan from a hospital known to have a high COVID caseload, it would use the font as a predictor of COVID risk, which is just, crazy. So I think the rush into the breach in the midst of a public health emergency bypassed a lot of these checks that may have otherwise been done to say, hey, wait a minute, let's call timeout on this and see, have we thought about edge cases? Is the data set we use to train this model appropriate? Should we be labeling these scans with, the result of a PCR test or something like that? And it was shortcutted. So it's kind of an interesting lens into what happens when people are in a hurry, shall we say.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I just want to give maybe a slight counterpoint to it. I completely agree with all of those biases and confounders. But if we think about where we were, a year and a half ago, and people weren't even sure, they thought maybe imaging is a better way to figure out if someone has COVID than a blood test, right? Or a nasal swab. And so we said, these don't need FDA approval. You look at the publication standards of the journals went down. You look at, everybody and his brother who knew anything about AI was trying to figure out how they could maybe contribute to this. And so there was just a lot of stuff that happened. And so then we look back with the survey and find, yes, there's a lot of stuff that happened. And I think that is unfortunate in a way, but it sort of speaks to the mindset at the time. And on the other hand, I think if you look at some of the high quality work that's done, there actually is some pretty high quality work done on COVID, but unfortunately hasn't been a dominant use case because of the other testing and other methods that we have now of diagnosing and treating the disease.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question from James. Why the bias against commercial use of data? If my data can help an entity like GE to develop a smart MRI machine, isn't that for the greater good? I don't have the capital or engineering capability to make one. Okay, that's a very nicely posed question. Yes, Andrea, go ahead.
I agree with that. In fact, I was going to comment earlier that collaborations where you're working with commercial industry industry and medical and patients together to develop a capability to improve patient health or improve population health or to improve things. That's totally legit use for patient data from a commercial standpoint. That's not the same as, as single institutions selling, 1 million, scans. It would be like the discussion we had earlier, where I can't remember who the presenter was, who said that partnering with an industrial partner to develop a capability that helps patients, that's legitimate, in my opinion.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, and I think everyone has certain conflicts of interest. Industry, academics do too. We are always looking for the next grant, for example. That can bias our opinions of things. So I think that anyone who wants to do good science or engineering and develop good technology, we ought to encourage that if we can. Yeah.
With the appropriate safeguards.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I have no problem with the commercial thing, but I think it'd be nice if the companies that profited from the initial data sets were to give some of that to the health systems that provided the data. That would be, we haven't seen a precedent for that yet. And it would be nice to get some help. Yeah.
I know at Stanford, we talk about mission-related sharing. So if it has to do with an educational mission or a research mission of the organization. So again, these kinds of, Andrea, what you were talking about, these collaborations, that's an instance where, yes, we would share data with a commercial entity and use it to develop potentially a commercial product.
And that's where an ethics overview board would be especially helpful, include not just grants, but in those type of ventures, and in helping then deconflict any conflict of interest from any of the researchers or the clinicians that wanted to be part of that research from the standpoint of being part of the company.
Good. Okay, I wanted to go back. This is a question that was posed by Tommy earlier in the thread, but from one of the other sessions, but I thought it was really interesting. Which ethical and privacy challenges are best managed through regulation versus through cultural norms and standards? It's a hard question, but wanted to get your thoughts. Too hard?
That's a pretty difficult one. As far as I think overarchingly, culture trumps oversight at any point. So I would always opt for the culture and having the right culture over the oversight. The oversight is there if you don't have the culture totally developed. So I don't think it's so much about what's best from a culture standpoint or what's best from an oversight standpoint. I think you have to take a look at where you are from a cultural standpoint in your organization. Nina, for example, her organization already is value-based, so her organization is going to need less oversight than maybe another organization where they don't have that kind of culture in place already and maybe working towards it, but until they get to that place, they would need someone to help them from an oversight standpoint.
It's interesting too with the FDA and their pre-certification program and the way they're looking at evolving how they are clearing products. They're looking at clearing the entity and making sure that the entity itself is doing a good quality service rather than the product. And that speaks to the culture. Now, where I think regulation and law is important, I mean, the basis of a lot of our laws are to protect our human rights. And if there's something where there's a human rights issue, whether it's dignity, equality, discrimination, then those are something that probably should be overseen by legal entities.
In the aerospace industry, from a quality standpoint, when you have subcontractors, you basically certify their quality process and the organization that you don't, and then you do, sort of spot audits, but you actually certify the process. And AI, I would say, is more akin to a process and a system. So you have to really certify that or oversee that, not each individual algorithm or data sharing instance.
Yeah, so, and a number of speakers today alluded to that process that the FDA has proposed in a white paper as to how they might, just what you were describing, they might certify the organization rather than, and a number of other things, post-market monitoring and so forth. But that's also had some pushback. I know there are at least 2 senators that wrote to the FDA and said, that's, if you do it that way, you don't appear to really have the regulatory authority to do it that way. And then you have the issues like oversight of aircraft by the FAA, and how having the kind of embedded regulator with the company leads to some difficulties. So that seems like, I think the FDA is in a very difficult spot, that they want to figure out a way that's practical to approve algorithms that might change over time. That's going to be a necessity, I think. But I don't really see the clear path to that. Do any of you see the clear path, or where do you think that's headed?
There's more than a few calls in DC for just a whole new agency, an FDA for algorithms that doesn't exist today. Because you look outside of the context of healthcare, algorithms are used to decide who gets access to university, who gets what interest rate on the bank loan, et cetera, et cetera. And a cottage industry that's growing quickly, I think, is the audit and measurement, algorithmic audit and measurement industry. Even going back as early as 2015, 2016, the Obama administration had recommended the development of an industry for auditing and measuring algorithms, the same way accounting firms would, audit your taxes, your finances for a publicly held company. So, it may get to that. That's an extreme example, but it's not unprecedented. I mean, the Department of Homeland Security didn't exist before 9/11, and now we have a new cabinet secretary as a result of that. So the commercial viability of AI, I wouldn't underestimate its power to motivate a move that substantial.
An interesting thought. I think the FDA, when you think about FDA, Food and Drug Administration, why are they overseeing software? They've evolved a lot. In the past, they mostly oversaw hardware. So for them to start overseeing software has been a bit of an evolution. I think they did a lot under Scott Gottlieb, who was the last FDA commissioner, and he's the one that is recommending this pre-certification program. I think they're moving quickly in that direction, but it's an area that they don't have a lot of experience in right now. It's new.
Good.
And just to comment on the embedded oversight process, since I was in aerospace and the Boeing, obviously the Boeing issue. I think what happens after a while is that there becomes a little bit of complacency. So it's almost like the embedded is really good as you go through the process, but then you need someone who actually does a further oversight step on that, because it can become too comfortable a relationship, and you have trust develop, and it's not always warranted.
Yeah, I've read a few toxic torts cases, and lo and behold, a lot of the people at the naughty chemical company used to work at the EPA, so it's not just unique to aerospace and FDA.
We only have a couple minutes left, but really quick, since you raised the issue of torts, this notion of decision support in medicine has been around a long time. We talked about drug allergy alerts and these kinds of things. There aren't really a lot of examples of a decision support company being sued for its decision support. Really, who gets sued is the physician for not following the standard of care, and the jury doesn't care whether they saw an AI or read a book or saw a CME course or whatever resources they're using. They should be following some standard of care and appropriately digesting the information. Do others kind of agree that that's the situation we're in, or do you know of cases where we should be thinking the legal environment's going to change for these AI manufacturers? In 1 minute.
I think ultimately we're the physician, we're the one that's interpreting the AI. We need to understand it. We're the ones that are providing that information. We're the ones that are taking the responsibility and accountability.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's what the patients want too. They don't want unsupervised AI.
Well, I just want to thank you all. This has been a tremendous discussion. We've hit on a whole variety of topics, and we're so happy to have your expertise from patients, industry, healthcare providers, researchers, all focused on this very important topic of ethics and legal issues in AI. With that, we'll close the session, and I want to turn it over to David Larson for some closing remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Curt, and thank you everyone to this presentation, this panel, and all of our presenters and moderators throughout the day. Wow, what a rich and thoughtful dialogue throughout the day, really moving the conversation forward. I do have one brief additional thought I'd like to share before we wrap up, but before we do, just a couple of quick items. First of all, we'd ask if you could take a moment to complete the evaluation. We'll be emailing that to you in the next couple of days. And I really want to thank our partners. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Stanford High and the Amy Center. A huge thanks to our meeting organizers and our support team, Ala Youssef, Joanna Kim, Katie Pontius, Ashley Williams, Jacqueline Thomas, Amy Thomas, Rob Huffman, Tim Neff, and Kevin Morrison. They've just been fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank my co-directors, Drs. Michael Recht and Yvonne Louie from NYU. And finally, if it's okay, if I can leave with you with one brief thought before we wrap up. While there are many questions that still need to be answered, it really is striking to me with this conversation today how much it has significantly advanced in sophistication and understanding and awareness since just 2 years ago at our last Boulder Summit. So while it might be overwhelming and perhaps discouraging looking at all that we have to do and have to figure out in terms of ethics and AI, I personally take a lot of satisfaction and a lot of heart that we are starting to ask the right questions and seek for the answers intelligently and with genuine good faith and with the right stakeholders. David Magnus referred to the importance of striving, which really resonated with me. And I think if we step back and put this in context, this is such an incredibly transformative technology in the whole history of humankind, and it's hitting us with breathtaking speed and scope. And while we don't yet have all the answers, I believe that engaging in thoughtful and inclusive dialogue to work towards shared values and policies is a critical part of this effort that will have benefits for decades to come, that will lay the foundation that those who follow will be grateful for if we do it well. So on behalf of the Stanford and NYU Departments of Radiology, thank you so much for joining us virtually today. We look forward to seeing you at our next Boulder Summit, hopefully in person next time in New York City. Until then, we wish you the very best. Have a great day.